Every week, thousands of plant owners across the country walk into their local garden center and do the exact same thing. They grab a bottle of liquid plant food off the shelf. 10, 15, sometimes $25 a bottle. They bring it home, follow the instructions on the label, mix a few drops into their watering can, and feed their favorite plant exactly the way the bottle tells them to. 2 weeks later, they check the leaves. Still yellow at the edges. Maybe 1 or 2 more leaves have dropped since the last time they looked. So what do? They buy a different bottle. This time the premium one, the one with organic printed in green letters across the front, twice the price of the last one. And somehow, the result is almost identical. Maybe a tiny bit of improvement. Nothing close to what the label promised. Here's the part that almost nobody in the plant care world wants to admit. Your plant is probably not starving. That's not what's happening here. The real problem is something most plant owners have never even considered. And once you understand it, you're going to look at every fertilizer bottle in your house completely differently. Let's start with a basic question. What does a houseplant actually need in order to grow? Most people say nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. That's what every bottle on the shelf is shouting at you with. Big, bold numbers on the front. 10, 10, 10, or 15, 30, 15. Designed to make you think more numbers means more growth. But here's what they don't put on the label. Your potting soil already has nutrients in it. Almost every bag of potting mix sold in this country starts out with enough nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium to support healthy growth for months. The problem isn't what's missing from the bag. The problem is what's happening inside the pot after you've had that plant for a year or two. Root systems don't absorb nutrients directly out of a liquid you pour on top. They absorb them through microscopic air pockets and channels running through the soil. Think of healthy potting soil like a sponge, full of tiny gaps that let water drain through while still holding onto moisture and oxygen at the same time. That structure is what lets roots breathe and lets nutrients actually reach them. But every time you water, every time the soil dries out and gets watered again, and again, month after month, that structure slowly collapses. The tiny particles compact together. The air pockets disappear. What used to be a sponge turns into something closer to dense clay. This is called soil compaction. And it is almost never mentioned by fertilizer companies because it has nothing to do with the product they're selling you. Once your potting mix compacts, the roots sitting inside it are essentially suffocating. They can't access oxygen. Without oxygen, roots can't actively pull in nutrients, even if those nutrients are sitting an inch away. Water starts pooling instead of draining, which invites root rot. And the beneficial microorganisms that normally break down organic matter into a form roots can start dying off in that dense, oxygen-starved environment. So even a fresh, fully loaded bottle of fertilizer poured onto compacted soil is basically wasted. The food is there, the plant just can't reach it. This explains something that confuses a lot of plant owners. You've been feeding your pothos or your fiddle leaf fig on a strict schedule, doing everything the label says, and it's still yellowing. It's not because you're doing the feeding wrong, it's because the delivery system underneath the soil has broken down, and no amount of liquid food fixes a delivery problem. So what actually fixes it? 2 ingredients, both of which are probably already in your kitchen right now. Crushed eggshells and ground cinnamon. I know how that sounds. Stay with me, because the mechanism here is actually pretty straightforward once you see it. Crushed eggshells, when mixed into compacted soil, do 2 things at once. First, as they slowly break down over weeks, They physically create tiny gaps and pockets inside the soil, restoring some of that sponge-like structure that got lost to compaction. Second, they release calcium gradually as they decompose, and calcium plays a direct role in strengthening cell walls in root tissue, which helps roots stay firm and functional even in soil that's been stressed. Cinnamon, on the other hand, has natural mild antifungal properties. When you loosen up compacted, overly moist soil, you're creating exactly the kind of environment fungal pathogens love, the ones responsible for root rot. A light dusting of cinnamon worked into that same area helps keep those fungal populations in check while the soil structure is recovering. Neither of these is a fertilizer in the traditional sense. They're not there to add a big new dose of nutrients. They're there to fix the actual delivery system, the physical structure of the soil, so that whatever nutrients are already present, it's from the original potting mix or from whatever you feed it going forward, can actually reach the roots again. That's the piece the entire liquid fertilizer industry skips over because a bottle of plant food can't fix soil structure. Structure isn't something you pour in. It's something you rebuild. Before you run to your kitchen and start dumping crushed shells into every pot in your house, there are a few rules that actually matter here. Because doing this wrong can genuinely stress a plant that's already struggling. Rule number 1. Test the soil first. And I mean physically test it. Not guess. Take a small handful of soil from the pot, about an inch or 2 down, not just the dry surface layer. Squeeze it firmly in your fist. Then open your hand. If it holds together in a solid, dense clump that barely breaks apart when you poke it, that's compacted soil. That's your target. If it crumbles apart easily and feels loose and airy, your soil structure is probably fine. And the yellowing you're seeing is more likely a watering, light, or pest issue instead, which this method won't solve. This 5-second test saves you from wasting effort on a problem you don't actually have. Rule number 2. Prep your eggshells the right way. Rinse the shells thoroughly so there's no leftover egg white or yolk residue, since that residue is what attracts gnats and other pests indoors. Let them air dry completely for a day or 2. Then crush them into a fine, almost powdery texture, either with a mortar and pestle or by pulsing them in a food processor. Chunky shell pieces take months to break down and won't help much in the short term. Fine powder starts integrating into the soil structure within just a couple of weeks. Rule number 3. Get the ratio right. For a standard 6 to 8 inch pot, mix the crushed shells from about 3 to 4 eggs with roughly half a teaspoon of ground cinnamon. Sprinkle that mixture evenly across the top of the soil. Then use a small stick. A chopstick works fine, to gently work it into the top 2 to 3 inches of soil without disturbing the deeper root ball too aggressively. Do this once every 3 weeks. Not weekly. Not every few days. Soil structure rebuilds gradually, and overdoing frequency doesn't speed that up. It just risks damaging fine surface roots from too much disturbance. Rule number 4. And this is the one people skip most often. Never do this to bone-dry soil. Water the plant lightly a day before you plan to work the mixture in. Dry, brittle soil is more likely to crack and shift roots when you disturb it. And roots that are already stressed from drought don't handle that kind of physical disruption well. A slightly damp base makes the whole process far gentler on the plant. If you follow those 4 rules, here's roughly what to expect. Because I don't want to oversell this to you. In the first week, you likely won't see much of anything. That's normal. Soil structure doesn't rebuild overnight. And neither does a root system's ability to use it somewhere between week 2 and week 3. After your second application is usually when people start noticing something, not the old yellow leaves turning green again. Because leaves that have already yellowed and are on their way out generally don't reverse. What you're looking for instead is new growth. New leaves coming in noticeably darker and healthier than the older ones around them. That's the signal that the roots are finally accessing what they need again. By week 6, most people see a real difference in overall fullness. New stems. Less leaf drop. A plant that looks like it's actively growing instead of just surviving. It's worth knowing that soil compaction doesn't happen at the same rate everywhere in the country. And your local climate plays a bigger role in this than most people realize. If you're in a drier region, somewhere like the Southwest or parts of the Mountain West, your indoor air tends to pull moisture out of soil faster, which means the soil dries and re-wets in tighter cycles, and that repeated shrink and swell action is actually one of the fastest ways to compact fine potting mix. If you're in a humid region instead, the Gulf Coast, the Southeast, much of the Midwest in summer, soil tends to stay damp longer between waterings. And that extended wet period is what feeds fungal growth in already compacted pockets. Which is exactly why the cinnamon half of this method matters as much as the eggshell half in those climates. Knowing which pattern you're dealing with helps you understand why the same plant can behave completely differently in a house in Arizona versus a house in Georgia. Even with identical care, not every houseplant responds to this the same way. And it's worth being upfront about that instead of pretending it's a universal fix. Tropical foliage plants. Things like pothos, philodendron, peace lilies, and fiddle leaf figs tend to show the clearest results because they naturally prefer soil that holds a bit of moisture while still draining well, which is precisely the balance that compaction destroys first. Snake plants and ZZ plants, which are more drought-tolerant by nature, usually don't compact as quickly to begin with, since they're typically watered less often, so you may not see dramatic changes simply because the underlying problem was never as severe. And if you're growing anything in a soilless mix, puras fachnimos, leca, or a semi-hydroponic setup, this method doesn't really apply at all. Since there's no traditional soil structure to rebuild in the first place, one thing people frequently get wrong is confusing a nutrient deficiency with a structural problem, because the visual symptom, yellowing leaves, looks almost identical for both. A true nitrogen deficiency usually shows up as uniform, pale yellowing that starts with the oldest, lowest leaves first and moves upward evenly over time. Compaction-related yellowing tends to look patchier and less predictable, sometimes showing up on newer growth just as often as older leaves. Often paired with slower overall growth and soil that stays wet noticeably longer than it used to after watering. If you're not sure which one you're dealing with, the squeeze test from earlier is still your fastest way to tell the difference before spending money on the wrong fix. A few honest warnings before you try this, because I'd rather you avoid a mistake than have this backfire on you. If your pot doesn't have a drainage hole, this method is going to have limited impact, because the underlying issue in a pot with no drainage isn't just compaction, it's water with nowhere to go. And that's a different problem requiring a different fix. Usually repotting into something with proper drainage. If you're working with succulents or cacti, cut the frequency down to once every 5 to 6 weeks instead of 3. These plants are naturally adapted to lean, fast-draining soil. And treating them the same as a tropical plant like a pothos or a peace lily can actually overcorrect the moisture balance they prefer. And don't use eggshells that still have residue on them. It sounds like a minor detail, But indoor gnat infestations are almost always traceable back to some organic residue sitting in damp soil. And unwashed shells are a perfect breeding ground. Let me tell you about a plant I almost gave up on completely. I had a pothos on a shelf near my window that had been declining for months. Roughly half the leaves had gone yellow. A few had dropped entirely. And I'd already tried 2 different liquid fertilizers over about 10 weeks with basically no change. Out of frustration more than confidence, I did the squeeze test on the soil. And sure enough, it came out as a dense, compact clump, barely crumbling at all. I started the eggshell and cinnamon routine every 3 weeks. First week, nothing visibly different, which honestly had me doubting it was going to work at all. By the start of week 3, right after the second application, I noticed the newest leaf coming in was a noticeably deeper green than the leaves around it, which hadn't happened in months. By week 6, after the third round, there were 2 new stems growing from the base that hadn't been there before. And while the previously yellowed leaves never turned back green, no new leaves were yellowing anymore, which was the real turning point for me. That plant has been on the same routine, roughly once a month. Now, for maintenance. For over a year, and it hasn't had a yellowing episode since. I later tried the same approach on a peace lily that had been drooping between waterings no matter how consistent I was. And the timeline played out almost the same way. No visible change in the first week. A noticeable difference in new growth by the third week. And by 2 months in, it had stopped drooping between waterings entirely, which told me the roots were finally able to pull in moisture efficiently again instead of sitting in compacted soil that either flooded or dried out too fast. Let's talk about what this actually costs, because the price gap here is honestly a little ridiculous. A single bottle of premium liquid plant food typically runs somewhere between $15 and $25, and depending on how often you're supposed to use it, that bottle might last 2 to 3 months before you're buying another one. Crushed eggshells cost you nothing beyond what you're already eating. They're a byproduct of breakfast you were going to throw away anyway. A jar of ground cinnamon runs a few dollars at any grocery store and will last you through dozens of applications across multiple plants for the better part of a year. Run the math on a typical plant parent with, say, 5 or 6 houseplants being fed regularly with commercial fertilizer, and you're easily looking at over $100 a year in product. Sometimes closer to $200 if you're buying the premium lines. The soil structure method costs you close to nothing, and it's addressing the actual mechanical problem instead of just adding more food on top of a broken delivery system. It's also worth knowing when this method isn't enough on its own, because there are cases where the soil has degraded past the point where working in eggshells and cinnamon can realistically fix it. If your plant has been in the same pot for more than 2 or 3 years without a repot, or if water sits on top of the soil for more than 30 seconds without soaking in at all when you water, that's usually a sign the compaction has gone deeper than the top few inches this method reaches. In those cases, the more reliable fix is a full repot into fresh potting mix. And you can actually combine both approaches, mixing crushed eggshells and a light dusting of cinnamon directly into the new soil as you repot, which gives the plant a head start with better structure from day 1 instead of waiting for a compacted mix to slowly improve. Think of the ongoing eggshell and cinnamon routine as maintenance for soil that's still mostly healthy, and a full repot as the reset button for soil that's already too far gone. If you've got a plant sitting somewhere in your house right now with yellowing leaves that hasn't responded to whatever fertilizer you've tried, do the squeeze test before you buy anything else. It takes 5 seconds, and it'll tell you whether you're dealing with a nutrient issue or a structure issue. And those 2 problems need completely different fixes. Next time, I want to walk through the single most common watering mistake that ends up causing this exact kind of compaction in the first place. Something almost every new plant owner does without realizing it. And it's a lot easier to avoid than you'd think once you know what to look for.